Welcome folks, I'm the Angry Kiwi and I'd like to introduce you to Ashley Dawson, an English professor from NYU. Dawson has recently written a book with a lot of claims to make about capitalism and why it's destroying not only the earth, but society as we know it. Full disclosure, I haven't read his book, but I'm getting my info from an article published in The Guardian, link is in the description. So first and foremost, Dawson posits that modern-day capitalism was brought about by Europeans roughly 500 years ago, and that, as a system, it was rooted in colonialism, slavery, and environmental destruction. So let's tackle that first. I'm not going to deny the horrors of slavery, the devastation wrought in North America by colonials, or the many species of plants, animals, insects, and fish that have gone extinct as a direct result of exploitation for profit by humans globally. But the settling of America by British migrants was driven by Christianity. Slavery was the fault of people's fear and thinking of different people as lesser. The argument of environmental destruction actually has a leg to stand on, and I reckon Dawson knows this because it's the only position he defends going forward, even if he does play rather fast and loose with that argument. Dawson says, the global expansion of capitalism was a complete transformation in the foundation of human societies. So I looked up the political history of the world on Wikipedia, and it says, for the past 200,000 years and up to the 20th century, many people have lived in non-state societies. These range from relatively egalitarian bands and tribes to complex and highly stratified chiefdoms. I don't think it's unfair to assume that the majority of these societies operated in some sense for profit, however you gauge that metric: more land, more gold, more grain, more sheep, goats, horses. I also don't think it's unfair to assume that these societies were by majority exploitative of natural resources. I'm sure they would have taken all they could get. But to my mind, the only transformation was the regulation of previously existing private businesses and operations. But I struggle to see how increased involvement by the state in said marketplace was driven by, or even positively affects, true capitalism. True capitalism prefers to be unmanaged, and would reject any and all involvement by the state in the marketplace. So to say capitalism itself drove a complete transformation in the foundation of human societies? Citation motherfucking needed. Dawson continues, the global expansion of capitalism was the substitution of an ecocidal and genocidal system for the relatively sustainable social forms that preceded it. Wait, hang on, I thought capitalism was rooted in environmental destruction. How could that be possible if all preceding social forms were sustainable relative to capitalism? Unless you mean relatively sustainable in the common sense, that they weren't completely sustainable, but only relatively so. But then, it seems to be that both the capitalist model and the preceding social forms are both moderately sustainable. Maybe their sustainability isn't predicated then on whether it's the government or private pockets running the corporations and manufactories, which nullifies your point even fucking harder. And ecocidal? Give me a fucking break. You're not even talking about capitalism, you're talking about a capitalist free market. All your examples, beaver pelts, whaling, Native American bison, are from people exploiting natural resources for profit, which is why now, today, we have fucking laws to stop people doing exactly those things, to save the surviving populations. And, short of poachers endangering the populations of rare, exotic and sought-after animals operating outside the law, these laws work pretty well. It's the same reason we have laws against child labour, slavery, and animal abuse even. I'm not sure, but not only might you be conflating a free market with capitalism itself, you might not be aware that we don't actually have a free market. All those rules and regulations about how old your employees have to be, minimum wage, licenses to produce, source or sell certain endangered or restricted resources, social fucking welfare, they all limit the freedom of the marketplace. I'll get to a bit more information against this point later on, namely describing why committing ecocide would be a terrible idea for any capitalist, or really any for-profit exercise. And so, genocidal? You're saying that genocide is a constituent part of capitalism? We have to be specific. This cannot be just counting the death toll of capitalism versus socialism, because theoretically that could include anyone that died in a capitalist or socialist nation, and to blame capitalism or socialism respectively for that is one hell of a fucking stretch. The accusation has been laid, and it is one of genocide. Genocide is defined in quite a complicated manner, but the most relevant things I could find were from Google and Wikipedia. First, Google says genocide is defined as the deliberate killing of a large group of people, especially those of a particular nation or ethnic group. However, Wikipedia tells me that, under the Genocide Convention, the crime of genocide does not apply to the mass killing of political and social groups. So, because capitalism is a concept and therefore can't do anything deliberately, you likely mean just general mass killings, or more accurately, politicide, which is the killing of members of political groups for their political views with the goal to eliminate that political group. Now, provide me one example of any mass killing that capitalism is directly responsible for. Wars against communist states don't count, since socialism could be blamed as easily as capitalism for deaths in such wars, and neither does the Native American versus the migrant settlers debacle, since that has more to do with Britain's religious oppression than their economy. The best I could come up with was a conspiracy theory that the US's wars against Middle Eastern countries were somewhat driven by capitalism because the government wanted a stronger economy, so funded private companies to build various war machines. But again, it seems a stretch to directly link that to capitalism when that was just governmental profit mongering, which capitalism is not, whatever you might think. So not only has no society instituting a capitalist regime committed the crime of genocide, but there isn't any historical mass killing I can find that can be directly linked to capitalism. Socialism, however? Stalin's gulags, Lenin the Red Terror, Mao and his People's Civil War, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge? The lowest estimate of these mass killings is almost 100 million non-combatants, and all of them were a direct result of communist states attempting to rid the world of their political opponents, specifically for their opponents' political and economic position. Capitalism is a genocidal system, citation motherfucking needed. You know, I do think it's important that we know what we're talking about here. Capitalism is not what rules our government. Capitalism isn't even about free markets. Capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. Vice versa is socialism, where a country's trade and industry are controlled by the state for the profit of the state. I think it's important to note that no one on Earth lives in a truly capitalist society. The majority of the first world lives in democratic capitalist meritocracies. A truly capitalist nation wouldn't even have a traditional government. Its only quantifier of what makes one person greater or lesser than another is not how many people voted for them, i.e. democracy, not the achievements they have made, i.e. meritocracy, but only how much capital each person has managed to gain throughout their life, hence capitalism. Now, to address Dawson's claim that capitalism is an economic system based on exploiting ecosystems as much as possible. First of all, it's an economic and political system, but more relevant is your use of the word exploiting. The implication here is that under capitalism, the ecosystem's resources are to be exploited and profited from as much as possible until exhaustion of the resource, and therefore the destabilization of the ecosystem. This is where we tie back into the ecocide argument, that actually doing this would not only be a stupid thing to do in general, but a terrible business practice, especially under a capitalist business model. And it's real simple. Farms. Fucking farms. Sustainable, stable resources are more profitable than exhaustible ones. Logic out of 10, Dawson. Anyone with any sense knows that if you exploit a resource that isn't sustainable, that can run out and damage the ecosystem, you make less net profit with more net effort spent to gather the resource. Successful entrepreneurs think long term, and it's just fucking obvious that in the long term, sustainable resources are superior in every way to limited ones. And so, onwards and forwards, this is where it gets just ridiculous. After submitting the completely unsubstantiated claim that capitalism itself is a serious and direct harm to the biodiversity of our home planet, Dawson suggests a fix for this. Literally institute socialism. Well, except we choose the places where it operates, and limit it to areas known as biodiversity hotspots. Focusing a guaranteed income on the biodiversity hotspots would remove the prime economic motive people in such areas have for destroying their local environment, which Dawson claims is poverty. Fuck me, this is just absolutely bonkers. According to Dawson, the increasing human population in these areas is not responsible for our ecological crises. Whoa, I'm getting crazy deja vu. It's almost as if there's a citation motherfucking needed. I watched the latest Attenborough documentary on India recently, and he talks extensively about how overpopulation in certain areas is having a disastrous effect on the indigenous species. I also watched part of a TV series called Wild Japan, and it featured an entire episode about how bears, foxes, and several varieties of monkey are becoming endangered and facing more day-to-day risks because of the ever-increasing human population. In fact, I can almost see why you'd think the way you do, because the most disturbing things to these ecosystems are the farms that feed all the mouths. And farms are run privately, for profit, so capitalism's fault, right? Well, hear this. I'm going to tell you the most important thing to understand about how capitalism affects our society. Supply and fucking demand. There aren't more farms because capitalism, there are more farms because there's more demand for food, because there's more mouths to feed. Poverty is the prime economic motivator for these people. Overpopulation is a well-known cause for economic depression and widespread poverty. But no, our growing population couldn't possibly be the problem. I don't like to slander, but Jesus, how did you get a job teaching economics at a university? Oh right, you teach English, not economics. And here, just to highlight the stupidity of this, are a couple quotes from the article. If we accept Dawson's argument, what do? We could start by supporting, with money, the human populations living in or near biodiversity hotspots. The income could come from a tax on financial transactions that have enriched the world's wealthiest people and have been partially responsible for moving funds from developing countries to already wealthy ones. How do we implement any of this? How do we decide what constitutes a biodiversity hotspot? How do we decide who gets to live there, receiving their free money? How do we categorize which people have been responsible for taking money away from the economies of developing nations? Fuck! Direct quote from Dawson. We do not lack alternatives to capitalism today. What we lack is the political power to overcome capitalism. We aren't ruled by capitalism! Fuck!